What's good, folks? Happy New Year! Starting off with a continuation of this new series, the Versus series, putting two frames with somewhat similar aesthetics, role, or viewpoint by the community to see what they do and where they shine so you can decide which frame is better for you. I already did something like this for Rhino and Revenant. If you want to see that, do check it out. Today we're going to take a look at Gara and Frost. Compared to Gara, Frost is an older frame, but has received a lot more quality of life updates than Gara, even though two of his abilities need a rework. Frost is a lot easier to pick up and use as his kit is a lot straightforward and does exactly what it says. Gara, on the other hand, has an interesting synergistic kit and requires a bit more of an investment than Frost, as she needs a dedicated weapon slot to just make her kit work. But both frames have a lot of nuance to their builds and playstyle. Yet both frames are considered defense frames and seen as stationary frames that stay in one spot to do one job. That was definitely true for Frost back in the day, as people only wanted him to defend an objective, while Gara was seen as a frame who could somewhat do the same with her 4, but also nuke enemies. So let's go over their kits and see what makes them tick. Passives are usually something niche, yet make the kit have some additional synergy. It wasn't the case with Frost and Gara back in the day, but they got some updates. Frost got a better update to his passive. Since Frost now applies the cold status effect with his abilities, his passive increases the cold status effect duration by 100% and grants himself 50 armor per chilled enemy within a 15-meter radius. Frozen is a complete incapacitation, while chilled enemies are just cold procced enemies. Cold procs on enemies is a universal debuff, making them more vulnerable to critical damage. The bonus armor you get does contribute to his third ability, so that's a nice addition, even though it does nothing for him as a Warframe, since shields are just superior. And he can get Overguard. To add on to that damage, Frost has an augment for his passive. If enemies are frozen, they now take bonus crit chance and crit damage, which is additive to the cold status effect crit damage vulnerability. And because Gara is glass, her body is a reflective surface and has a 15 to 20% chance to blind enemies within a 12-meter radius for 10 seconds and opens them up for melee finisher attacks. Even though melee finishers benefit the damage multiplier on her second ability, it's a nice gimmick but does not contribute to how Gara plays, but could be something interesting for people out there who want to do something like that. Now, onto the ability section. This is where things are a hit or miss, depending on who you're looking for to play. Starting off with Frost's first ability, he throws out a projectile, and on impact it explodes within a 5-meter radius and freezes enemies on contact, as it applies an instant 10 stacks of cold. It can be reapplied on enemies to extend the frozen duration. It does tickle levels of damage, so it's mostly used to quickly freeze a target, detonate the third ability, or used as a cold elemental damage multiplier on your weapons with its augment freeze force. That's all it does. Now, Gara's first ability is unique and somewhat bloated. Shattered Lash is a weapon/ability, but not an exalted weapon. It is known as a pseudo-exalted, so it scales with both Warframe and melee equipped mods, requiring a stat stick. A stat stick is a melee weapon not used as a traditional melee weapon, but a vessel used to boost the damage of the ability, because the ability has its own hidden stats. Sad part is that it cannot crit or proc any status effects unless you use specific weapons. And it also scales with combo counter to deal even more damage. The weapon of choice matters only with specific builds. The base core stats of the melee weapons do not matter. I repeat, the base core stats on the melee weapons do not matter. Only their unique traits, Incarnate or Kuva upgrades, and damage buffing skins. Yes, there are skins that literally give you bonus damage on specific weapons. Because when you're putting mods on the melee weapon, you aren't modding the weapon, but the ability. Always keep that in mind. So So the ability has two attack modes, a quick tap and a hold cast. The quick tap thrusts out a sword that knocks enemies back and deals puncture damage, and the hold cast will do a swing motion that topples enemies, dealing slash damage. However, if you want to proc or deal damage, then you have to use a specific stat stick to make these things work. Check out the pop-up videos that show up on the corner of the screen to get an idea of how to build around her kit. Now onto the second abilities. Frost's Ice Wave. Not looking good here, buddy. He punches the ground to erupt ice shards that are sent out as a wave that deal tickle levels of damage and proc cold on enemies. That's all it does. Gara's Splinter Storm. Also another bloated ability, but I'll keep it simple. She surrounds herself or targeted allies with shards of glass that grant damage reduction. It deals damage to enemies who get close to you and makes enemies more vulnerable to damage. This ability has the potential to scale into billions of damage as it synergizes with her third and fourth ability. So you can cast your fourth ability to then shatter your fourth with your first ability, and the damage dealt to the fourth ability gets absorbed as damage stacks on your second. This then enables the second ability to infinitely scale in damage, to then just walk up to enemies and nuke them with a touch. However, to do this, she does need very specific gear and a fair bit of investment. And shattering mirrors on the third ability also contributes to the second ability damage stacking. The biggest weakness of her second is nullifiers and falling off the map. Good thing violence can't get rid of these stacks, because once they're gone, you have to build everything up again. So the longer you play in a mission, the stronger she gets. Now, things get interesting with Frost. Snow Globe is a defensive barrier that Frost unleashes. It pushes back enemies and freezes them. Enemies within the globe are slowed with cold procs. The globe health scales with strength modifiers, Frost's armor values, and absorbed damage. When the globe is cast, it has a brief moment of invulnerability where it absorbs enemy damage to then boost its own health. You can cast multiple of these bubbles to refresh the invulnerability duration and stack its health. You and allies can shoot in and out of the bubble, but the enemies can't. The ability has an additional hidden nuke feature. Enemies knocked back by the globe take collision damage. That is true damage dealt to 50% of their max health. And this can be scaled with viral procs to enhance the health damage taken. But here's where it hurts. Thanks to DE coding, if enemies are knocked down, they do not take collision damage. And because enemies are frozen from making contact with globe, some of them count as being knocked down, and therefore they do not take collision damage. Not only that, once the freeze wears off, they fall down as if they were knocked down. So now they have to get back up just so they can actually take damage from his globe. And only some who are frozen yet not knocked down can take collision damage if they're pinned to a wall, but still not guaranteed as a standing frozen target. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. So please, DE, fix this or explain this. Spectral Rage, Gara's third ability, is a set of rotating mirrors that charm enemies for them to attack the mirrors and have damage reflected back to the attacker. Once the mirrors break, they explode, dealing tickle levels of damage. The amount of mirrors scale with your range modifiers, and the mirrors' explosions contribute to Gara's second ability. The mirrors have really high threat levels, good to grab enemies aggro, but that's about it. Spectral Rage is only ever useful with its Augment Spectral Siphon for an influx of energy orbs. Avalanche, Frost's fourth ability. It's so simple, yet so good. Mass AoE instant freeze, and with 167% strength, you perma-strip enemy armor. And if enemies that are frozen by Avalanche die, they violently shatter. This ability has an augment that grants overguard to Frost and his allies based on strength and enemies hit by Avalanche. Mass Ventrify. This is where people compare Frost and Gara the most, because this ability is a mix of Snow Globe and Avalanche. Gara plants herself and expands a ring of glass that crystallizes anything that it comes into contact with, and crystallized enemies are vulnerable to all incoming damage. While Gara's expanding this ring, she is invulnerable to damage and drains energy per second. The glass ring has similar scaling to Snow Globe, as it scales with armor and strength from Gara. However, enemies hit and crystallized by the ring contribute to their maximum health and shields to the ring's health. And when the ring shatters, it gets absorbed by the second ability, contributing to its damage scaling. Also, here's a great change that was added in. It no longer matters where you stand when you shatter the fourth ability. You still get the damage buff regardless. Just make sure you hit and shatter the ring. And of course, when you shatter the ring, it violently explodes to deal damage in the area. Here's a nice synergy. If you cast the fourth ability, it refreshes the duration of your second ability, because normally you cannot recast the second ability on yourself. So after summarizing both of their kits, you can see both frames do excel in defending a point and have pretty good crowd control, while also enabling themselves to deal significant damage to enemies. Gara debuffs enemies to have them take more damage from all sources, while Frost armor strips and makes them more vulnerable to crit damage. Now, for a basic pros and cons for both frames. Starting off with Gara, she does a lot of damage, has pretty good survivability, but she's very gear specific and gear dependent, because without a stat stick, building her for damage on her 1, 2, and 4 will hit like a wet noodle, and she'll just be a crowd control unit with damage reduction and damage vulnerability, which is okay, but other frames would do that better. She doesn't have a wide range of build applications except dealing damage and dependent on various stat sticks if you want optimal versions of those different nuke builds. Frost's pros and cons. He can fit pretty much anywhere. All of his abilities have built-in crowd control and passive damage buffing because of the cold status effect, and he has built-in wide armor strip, and with augments, he's a great support. Fundamentally, his first two abilities are pretty much useless, as his third and fourth ability just do everything better. The one has its synergistic use to pop his bubble, otherwise it exists. Why freeze individual targets while you can press the fourth to have map-wide freeze? Seriously, DE. Always hoped his one would be a projectile that bounced and ricochets off targets, dealing additional damage per bounce. Each bounce gradually stacking cold procs and would deal even more damage on frozen enemies. And those frozen enemies shatter to then cause a chain reaction shatter effect to nearby frozen targets, and apply a few stacks of cold on enemies that aren't affected, which then can synergize with his fourth, instantly freezing enemies to have them take more damage and shatter with scaling damage. And you can have that for free DE. A lot of elemental powers feel very underwhelming in Warframe when you look at them objectively and thematically. So yeah, folks, now it's down to you to decide which frame is good for you and how you're looking to play the game, because both frames offer something that can benefit you in certain situations. But for a wide range of uses, Frost just fits into team comps a lot easier and has a lot more build applications, and is not heavily gear dependent. Anyway, folks, that has been it from me. I do hope you enjoyed and learned something from this video. If you did, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe for more Warframe content, streams, and so much more. Do refer to the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, a peace. Bye-bye now.